You guys hear me? Okay, we ready, Gina? Okay, hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, for joining us today for our on the menu presentation, state versus federal guidelines. We have Darby Ganschow here, Director of our Auxiliary Services, to discuss how state rules applies to purchasing on federal grants. There will be an opportunity for Q&A afterwards. We'll have some mics we'll pass around so they can be also picked up on Zoom. So enjoy. Thanks for coming, Darby.
Thanks, Linda. Everybody hear me? Good. All right. All right, try it again. Good afternoon. As Melinda stated, we're here to talk about purchasing and grant funds and how all of that works together. There's a lot of things to consider when you're using grant funds, and so we'll try to get into the details on some of that, give you a good idea of what laws and rules apply to grants versus non-grants and things of that nature. So, oops, no, why doesn't it work? Here we go. So first of all, we'll talk a little bit about types of grants. So I know that we have a lot of federal grants on campus. We also have some state grants and then some private grants. And so the federal grants, of course, are our federal laws in place with the grants that they award. And the state grants are typically state funds that are either routed directly through an institution or an agency, or maybe handled just as a pass-through of money, supposedly. So, and then on the private side, we've got foundations out there in the country that offer grants for research purposes and other things. And so we've got several types of grants. The good news is that we have always considered any of those types of grants to be really controlled by state law rather than by federal, private, or other law. But we're going to get into some of that detail today to kind of explain that. It's important to know when you're trying to expend funds from a grant to make sure you're following the rules for whatever applies to that particular grant. So looking at some references to federal law, we'll talk about that first. Just this morning, talking to Val and Jan in grants accounting, we found another circular from the federal government that related to grants that I wasn't quite aware of. And so that's why you get the next email with a revised PowerPoint. But in that circular, it's an OMB circular 20 USC 1001A. It basically says that acquisitions for supplies and services from institutions of higher ed, so us or other entities, they have what they call a micro purchase limit. And according to federal law, that limit is $10,000. And so what that means is that if you're buying things, your order is less than $10,000, it's considered a micro purchase. You don't have to go out and solicit competitive quotes and bidding and that type of thing. I mentioned just a bit ago that we consider state law when we expend funds from all these different types of grants, and state law is actually more restrictive than federal law in this case. So the state law is 4,000 versus federal law 10,000. We'll get into that in a little bit as well. It also goes on, though, to say that a higher threshold as determined appropriate by the head of the agency. Well, then if you look at the next bullet point and under Health and Human Services, Chapter 9236, it also indicates that we follow state law, but Health and Human Services actually has a $100,000 small purchase limit. So in their opinion and in their requirements, if you're buying things under 100,000, they consider it to be a small purchase and you don't have all the formal requirements to follow. So, but again, and then back into that 1, 2, 3, fourth bullet point, if you read towards the end of that, it says that a higher threshold is determined by an appropriate by the head of the agency. At the very end of that, it says or state law. So again, it's referring to the fact that state law seems to control these grant purchases. So that's what we're going to focus on. I'm not going to focus on the federal side of it because for the most part, we believe it doesn't apply. Also, then towards the end of that screen, the state auditors, we have audits from the legislative office virtually every year. And purchasing is one of the areas that they tend to audit. And they'll look at both grant expenses as well as just general state funds and non-state funds, that type of thing. And in all of the years that I've been working with state auditors, they too have always considered state law to be the governing force behind any of our expenses. So at least we have some documentation, we have information that indicates to us that we're to follow state law when we're using grant funds or not non-grant funds. So then when you talk about that, there are a number of laws and policies to consider. The good news is you don't have to know all of these. So myself and my staff do though. And so as we're getting orders from you through requisitions, we look to see how it's funded, what the dollar amounts are, and then we apply the appropriate law and policy to make sure that we are in compliance with state requirements. So the governing laws that pertain to procurement for us then, first of all, South Dakota codified laws, 518A, B, and D. It's 3 chapters of lots of different laws pertaining to lots of different things. And so if you want some reading, there's a link there you can click on and go out and do some research on state laws. We'll get into some of those requirements in just a bit so you have a better idea of what they say. Then we have Board of Regents policies, 5.3 and 5.4. 5.3 is related to contracts for services for the most part, or leases, things of that nature. There are some requirements there about getting approval from the Board of Regents for certain types of agreements. So if you're doing a contract for services that's over $50,000 per year and over 5 years, you have to get executive director approval from the Board of Regents. If you have a contract that's over $250,000 in any 1 year, you also have to get approval from the Board of Regents. And then they also, in the Board of Regents policy, they talk about capital assets. So if you're buying equipment, whether it be from a grant or non-grant, if that, well, there's 2 deviations there. If you're buying equipment from a non-grant and that equipment is, the cost is between $250,000 and $500,000, we have to get approval from the executive director of the Board of Regents. If that equipment is over $500,000, it has to go to the full board for approval on a scheduled board meeting. So there's a little planning there to take place. You know, it takes a couple of months to get on the agenda and get through the approvals. If you're buying that same equipment with a grant, the rules are a little bit different. You can go up to $500,000 without having approval from the Board of Regents. From $500,000 to $1 million, the executive director can approve them. And then if it's over $1 million, it has to go to the full board for approval. Again, so a timing issue on the larger, very large orders. I want to take one step back and give you a little bit more information on some federal requirements that we are required to go by. I've mentioned that we're using state law for the most part, but there are a number of things that the federal government requires. I'll just back up a screen that out on here. I'm just going to explain it to you, but there are things like the Israel boycott. There's a clause that we have to include in all of our bid documents that basically what it says is that the vendors we're buying product from are not discriminating against Israel. I don't know where the law came from or why, but basically Israel's our friends, and so we don't want them to be discriminated against, and so there's a law that protects that. And there's another one, it's the John McCain Act, and that one actually prohibits us from buying communications equipment from a company in China. It's a single company called Huawei, I think is how you pronounce it. They make surveillance equipment and communications equipment, and we cannot buy equipment that's manufactured by them. The problem with that is we buy from resellers. We don't necessarily know who manufactured the equipment. So we've done some research on it. We've found some orders that are related to this company, but nothing that is exempt according to this law. So just another thing that nothing for you to worry about, but for us on our end, we have to kind of watch to make sure that we're in compliance with these federal requirements. One more thing I want to point out, I looked this morning just to see, you know, how many orders are we processing against grant funds versus university funds. So this morning I ran a report based on this fiscal year to date. And today we have issued $2,697,000 worth of purchase orders using grant funds and $8,869,000 in total. So the grant funds make up a little over 20%. Number of orders was 1,358 with grant funds, 1,761 for all orders. So again, a little over 20%. And so when you think about the grand scheme of things at USD, you know, how do grants play into that? Well, 20 to 25% of our business probably. All right, so we're going to go back then to our laws and policies. So I talked about Board of Regents policies. The next section is USD policies. So we have two policies out on the USD website. 2.001 is contract approval policy. So that relates to contracts basically for services. And so you can go out to that policy and read it. We actually have tied to the policy an Excel sheet that has a lot of different contract types identified, whether it's lease agreements, affiliation agreements, whatever the case may be. And that spreadsheet shows the signature authority for those types of contracts. So if you're ever wondering if you're doing a service contract, who has the signature authority, you can refer to this policy and go to the spreadsheet and you'll most likely find it. I bring that up because, you know, I know we're talking about grants, but when it comes to service contracts, there's no difference between service contracts and equipment and supplies. We still have to follow state law. We still have to follow USD policies. And so I'm trying to bring forth some things that you need to consider if you're spending grant funds on services. And what you'll find in that policy under 2.001 is that the president has the ultimate authority to sign contracts on behalf of USD. And so unless she has delegated that authority to others, one example is consulting and general service contracts that you're processing through DocuSign. I have the authority to sign those if it's less than $30,000, and if it's over 30, then it goes to Jessica Preister, the interim VP for finance. So that's an example, but there are other types of things that, you know, sometimes a VP will have the authority to sign, or maybe a department head. And again, you can find all of that in that policy. And then we can move on to the USD policy, purchasing policy 2.049. In there, it indicates, you know, what the process is and what the rules are around the procurement of goods, basically equipment and supplies. And then we also break out services a little different than that. Just jump ahead 1 minute. So we're going to get into some of that in just a bit too, and give you some of what those requirements are. And then number 4 on this page is debarred vendors. This is another federal requirement. If we're buying equipment and supplies using federal funds, we have to go out to this website called sam.gov. The requirement is if the order is over $25,000, we have to check to make sure that that vendor is not debarred or suspended from doing business with the federal government. If they are, then we cannot do business with them either if we're using federal funds. This has been intact for quite some time. I don't know that we've ever found a vendor that's been disbarred or suspended, but we do check. So every order over 25,000, we go through this process to make sure that we aren't awarding to a vendor that shouldn't be awarded to. Okay, so now let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts of procuring things. So we're going to first talk about equipment and supplies. So we've identified that grant funds fall under state rules, right? And so now we're going to get into those state rules and let you know what those requirements are. So first of all, we talk about contracts. So the state of South Dakota, through the Office of Procurement Management, they bid and maintain a number of state contracts for equipment and supplies. So things like furniture, as an example, office supplies, a lot of different things. In addition to these state contracts, we also have a number of cooperative agreements. These cooperative agreements are contracts that were bid by usually they're a nonprofit public agency organization. So NASPO is an example of one of those. It's a National Association of State Procurement Officers, and the state of South Dakota participates in that. That's an agency made up of public agencies across the country. And so they look at what does higher ed need, or state government for that matter, across the country. What do they need for contracts? And so they'll go out and solicit bids for certain things, furniture being one of them. There's a NASPO agreement for it. And they'll go out and bid these contracts and then post them and make them available to any public agency in the country, providing your state law allows it. And South Dakota does allow it. And so we utilize quite a few of those. NASPO is one of them. We have E&I, which is educational and institutional. That's made up of organizations strictly in higher education across the country. So we utilize those. Sourcewell is another one. Omnia Partners is another one. And so between the state contracts and these cooperatives, we're able to buy a lot of things without having to go out for bid. And it meets all the requirements of both the state and the feds when we utilize those contracts. The only thing not the only thing, but we try to be careful of, if you're placing an order for a large dollar amount, we do a little research and make sure that that cooperative or even the state contract is, the most value for us. Are we getting the best price by using that contract? Sometimes on the cooperative agreements, we find that they're not always the best price. And so if we're buying a large quantity of something, or, it might be a piece of big construction equipment, something on that nature, we might find that we're better off going through a bid process instead of just using the contract. So we make that determination when we get an order from you folks. We'll work with you, talk about the options and do what's best for the university. So that's on the contracting side. I didn't put the links here, but those of you that are in South Dakota Easy Buy, on the home page, you'll find links to the state contracts at the bottom of that home screen. There's also links there to the cooperative agreements. Those are a little harder to find what you're looking for, because some of them are so large. They have lots of different kinds of contracts and you have to kind of dig into it a bit. But if you ever have questions about the use of a contract, whether it be state or a cooperative, contact one of us in the office and we'll certainly walk you through that. So then the next thing we need to consider in state law is that state law actually exempts certain items from bidding procedures. So this relates to grants as well. So if you're buying computer hardware and software, or laboratory apparatus and appliances, or medical supplies and equipment, those are all things that state law has exempted. State law says you don't have to go through the established bid process if this is what you're buying. It doesn't mean we shouldn't go out and get competitive pricing. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do our due diligence, but we have more options available to us than we would if it were a non-exempt item. So the two largest areas there obviously are computer hardware and software, and lab apparatus and appliances, which relates to scientific equipment basically. So those of you involved in the day-to-day purchasing probably know that USD buys all of the computer hardware and software and scientific equipment for all 6 of the Board of Regents institutions. So we're pretty close to this. And Raleigh T. Hard, my office, he's the buyer for the scientific side of things, and Linda Vanny Rothstein is the buyer for the computer side of things, or technology things. And so they do a good job of doing research, figuring out, what's the best process for whatever it is you're trying to buy. We have a number of contracts for these commodities. Again, some are in the punch out catalogs on the South Dakota Easy Buy site. We have several contracts for technology items with GovConnection and CDW and some of those types of vendors. Then on the scientific side, we have catalogs with Fisher Scientific, VWR, and some medical supply companies as well. There's quite a few of them out there. So there's a good chance that when you're buying these type of products, what you're buying is most likely covered by a contract of some sort. And so we have options there. We can choose to use a contract. We can choose to buy in our best interest. We can choose to put it out for competitive pricing. It just depends on the situation. And then the last exemption there, supplies and services for externally funded research. So this really talks more about grants. So we have these exemptions for all this, the scientific equipment's a good example here, where if you've got a grant and you're doing research, you're probably buying scientific equipment. So that in itself is exempt from all the bidding procedures. But we have a further exemption there that if, let's use the example of, you've got a research lab and you need to buy a piece of, and this happened several years ago, we had to buy some type of specialized HVAC equipment to control the temperature and humidity in this room where the research was being done. It wasn't considered part of the building that facilities would take care of because it was a portable unit. And so if we were buying that piece of equipment for non-research related purchases and not being paid with a grant, we would have had gone out for bid and gone through that process. Because we were using grant funds for the purchase, it now, according to this state law, is exempt from that process. So I don't remember the details and how we bought it, but we most likely went out and got some competitive quotes or something just to make sure we were getting the best value for the grant and made the purchase. So that's an example of even though the product itself isn't exempt, it was still exempt because it's for research and paying for it with grant funds, if that makes sense. Okay. And then just talking a little bit about the bid options, if we do, working with you, decide to go out and solicit competitive pricing for some of your things. If it's a non-grant purchase, then these things come into play a little bit more because we're required to do so. But if it is grant funded, we still have some options. So the most common in that regard is a request for quote. It's an informal process. We go out, solicit quotes from several vendors, try to get the best buy we can for you, and make an award off of that quote. The invitation for bid is a more formal process. It's where we actually advertise the bid, most likely in our local legal notices in the newspaper. We post it online on an online bid site, and we have a very strict process to go through where we have to pick a date and time where the bid opening is going to be, and we have to notify vendors of that, and we have to provide specifications so they know what to bid against, and then we do a formal bid opening at the time, and then work with you to make an award based on it. And then the last is a request for proposal. The RFP process is, it's like the invitation for bid, but it gives us more flexibility. So in that regard, we can put out our minimum specifications and say, we want it to do this type of function, right? But we're not set on an individual piece of equipment. We want to look at options, but we wanted the vendor to provide information that'll convince us that their product is the best one. So when you do an RFP, you're not tied down just to the spec and the cost. It's really an evaluation. And so you put together your evaluation criteria that we're going to look at this from a utility standpoint. We're going to look at it for total costs. We're going to look at it for its functionality, things of that nature. And we can do that through an RFP, and then you don't have to award to the lowest bid. We're getting to use this more and more all the time. We do it a lot in service contracts, but it's also coming into equipment as well when there are factors that need to be considered. So that's just the three options we typically use for making the purchase. The other thing that happens a lot, especially on scientific equipment, when you're buying off of grant funds, I know some researchers will do some work on their own and go out and maybe they're buying a centrifuge or some kind of specialized microscope. And there may be other options out there than just one company. I know it's not uncommon for that researcher to go out and solicit information from various vendors. They might even bring in demonstration or demo units for a period of time, let them try them out, and to make a good decision on what they want to buy. And that's all perfectly fine. Because it's scientific equipment and being bought with a grant, it's exempt from bidding, and so we have that flexibility. What we require in the end, though, is if they actually went through that process, then it doesn't make sense for us to necessarily go back out through a bid process. You've kind of already done that in a way, unless we think that there's a better price to be offered by doing some type of formal solicitation. But oftentimes that information is provided to us along with a justification. as to why they want to recommend a purchase to this particular company. And it'll provide things like, we did a demo, we had a demo unit from Fisher Scientific, from VWR, from, I don't know, maybe some manufacturer, and we required it to do this type of function or data analysis or whatever it may be. And then they justify that. And it isn't always the lowest cost unit that they recommend to purchase. And that's fine, as long as the justification supports what they want to do, then we're generally okay with that too. And so those purchases can be made. I've seen that done on some very expensive equipment over the years, microscopes, centrifuges, that type of thing, where it, it might be several $100,000, and but they did their homework. They went through a process to identify products and equipment and evaluated their abilities against what they needed to do. And I kind of think that's why scientific equipment is exempt by state law. I'm sure at some point there was a legislature or a group of them that looked at this and said, we got to have flexibility in buying scientific equipment. We can't just say, put it out for bid and take the low bid, because that doesn't work in that type of an area. So that's a little bit about how we do see some of that stuff being done. Before I move on, any questions that I might answer? We have microphones here. If anybody has an answer, we'll hand them out and do that.
I've got a question. Not what is lead time on some of the computers and things like that with the chip shortage?
Can you
Doesn't
say,
seem like
repeat
it's
that?
getting. What is the lead time on computer equipment with the chip shortage right now? Doesn't seem like it's getting any better.
Yeah, it's like everything. Everything's slow. I can tell you that. I can tell you, I don't know exactly. I'm not on a day-to-day basis. I don't really work on those too much. Linda handles most of it, but I've heard of lead times on certain things taking a couple of months. There was a computer order recently. It was a laptop order, and they wanted a particular laptop, but it was 2 to 3 months out, and so they ended up buying something that had a more available. And so it just depends on the product. We had one the other day. It was a docking station for a laptop. You wouldn't think a big deal, but they couldn't get one, and so they said it was going to be 2 to 3 months before we could get it. So it just really depends on the product itself. But there's on a not a technology related comparison, this week I had a Raleigh go out and get some quotes on some laundry equipment for our dorms, and the wash machines are still 6 to 8 weeks out. So I mean, it hasn't changed much. Prior to COVID, we could have gotten that stuff in a matter of a couple of weeks. Now we're 6 to 8 weeks out, and I see that across the board on a lot of things. We just bought, this is related to grants. Head Start has a federal grant for the Head Start office, and recently they needed to buy 2 vehicles for their Head Start staff. We usually buy them off of state contract, and Chevrolet had the bid for the Malibu. So I contacted the vendor in Pierre that had the contract and couldn't get them. He said that when the contract was awarded to them last year for the 2022 models, 2021, within 3 weeks after the award of the contract, the vendor called and said, cancel the contract, you're not going to get any. And so they haven't been able to buy a single vehicle off of that contract in almost a year. And so we had to end up going out and finding used vehicles for them that's sitting on dealers' lots. And we were able to do it that way and still be in compliance with the federal grant and with state law and whatnot. So yeah, there's a lot of things to consider that way.
I have another question for you, Mr. Ganschow.
Yeah.
From our audience. It says, even if no bid solicitation is required for scientific equipment, a sole source form is still required. Is that correct?
So yes, what we've been operating under, and this is, I don't know if it's written down anywhere, but generally if that equipment is over around $10,000, we say, this is a significant amount of money. And so rather than just get a requisition with a quote and cut an order, we like to have some justification that proves why we didn't go out and get competitive pricing. We're not required to, but we still have our due diligence to to consider in this situation. So we ask that you provide justification. Why is it that this unit's the only one that will work for you? Raleigh does go out and bid scientific equipment now and then, depending on what's being bought. And so that option's there. And we just ask that to cover ourselves if an auditor, whether it be state, federal, whatever, would look at it, even though it may be outside of the bid limits, was there a rationale that we didn't want to get competitive pricing? So short answer is yes, if it's over $10,000, we'd like to have that. Okay, thank you. Any others? If not, we'll move into a little bit about the exact requirements for state law, which now we know apply to grants, unless of course unless the item you're buying is considered exempt. So these requirements are for non-exempt items, whether funded with a grant or not, right? And so our requirement is there's a $4,000 limit. If you're buying a total order worth less than $4,000, we can make the award without doing any type of competitive bidding. There's several ways you can make that acquisition. You can do a purchase requisition, route it through our office. We'd be happy to cut a purchase order for it. You can buy it on a credit card. Some of you have procurement cards. You can use those. You can do a direct pay. If you have a vendor that's willing to ship you the item and send you an invoice, that's fine. You can do a direct pay on it after you receive the item. Or you can do an employee reimbursement. Occasionally, we get people wanting to buy something on eBay, especially in the lab area. We see that more often than other areas. And we don't have an eBay account or a PayPal account, whatever you're required to have, but we will allow up to $4,000. An employee could go out and make the purchase and get reimbursed for it. Our requirement there is that the equipment is actually received and it's in the condition that it was advertised to be in. If they buy it, comes in, it's broken, doesn't work, we have a hard time reimbursing for something that isn't functional. So got to be a little careful there, but there are options available for that. The next category is $4,000 to $25,000. In this regard, a purchase requisition is required. You cannot go out and just buy it yourself and get reimbursed or do a direct pay. You need to do a requisition. Let me back up one step. On the orders under $4,000, if it's computer hardware and software, you have to do a requisition. The reason for that is it has to go through ITS for approval to make sure they can support whatever it is you're buying. So computer hardware, software always requires a requisition. The only exceptions to that is occasionally especially software, we'll have to pay for it with a credit card. ITS still needs to approve it, but occasionally we can let them go by having an email approval by ITS. Okay. So then back to 4 to 25, you do purchase requisitions. According to state law, we have to solicit a minimum of 3 quotes, and then we have to get approval from the state procurement office on these orders before we can release the PO to the vendor. And so if we're going to go out and get competitive pricing, we prefer to do that in our office. We have an online bid system that we can use. We usually post those things out on the bid site for 4 to 5 working days. The state has recognized that as an acceptable time frame. So if we send it to them and we only have 2 quotes, but we can prove we had it out on the state bid site for a week, they generally will say, yep, it's fine, we'll go ahead with the award. The other thing under 4 to 25,000, this is a limit, according to state law, 25,000 is the limit where you have to do a formal bid process. So we've got 2 categories under that. 4 to 25, they want to see a minimum of 3 quotes, but they also allow some times where we say, you know what, this is in our best interest. We tried to get other quotes. We only could get 1, and they generally will go along with that. And so we have some options on that as well. But we do have to send the order out through them to be approved. And then when you get over 25,000, again, you're doing a purchase requisition. We have to have some minimum specifications as to what you're buying so we can put it out for bid and vendors can look at it. And we can't limit the specifications, so it limits it to 1 manufacturer. So examples are if it has a certain, just for ease of discussion, laundry equipment's a good example. You could limit it down to where you only wanted Speed Queen equipment. because of certain, the pump size, the water capacity, the drum size, that type of thing. But the state doesn't allow that. You have to make it general and say, we need a drum capacity up to or approximately this size. And those are the kind of specs you provide, and then it allows competition, and we're not limiting the competition by the specs. So that's required. And then when it is over 25,000, the state procurement office actually does the bidding on those. They have an online bid system similar to ours. They post it out there for state law requires a minimum of 10 days from the point of it being advertised to the point of being looking at the bids. So there's really at least a 2-week lead time there on those types of bids. And generally, when you're doing an invitation for bid, you're awarding based on the specifications you provided and the low bid. Those are really the only two considerations, unless it's availability, like we just talked about. If somebody can't get anything for 6 months, then we're probably going to go ahead and do somebody else. Then an RFP, like I explained earlier, is another option for those types of bids, which we occasionally do when there's factors other than cost involved. All right. What have I missed? Any questions before we move on? Cheryl? Could you use the mic that way the Zoom people hear you, please? Thank you.
Yes, on item number 4, I don't know if my memory serves me correctly, but every time I've put in a purchase order or purchase requisition, not on the punch out on the easy buy, I am asked for a quote on the $1,000 to $4,000 range.
Yeah, that's a good point.
What is your specifications or your guidelines to have a quote attached with that requisition?
So yeah, the point there is that if we're going out to actually bid something, the quote from the department isn't as important. But when we're doing a purchase order for something, say it's under 4,000, we're not going out for bids. We'd like to have a quote from the vendor provided, because normally the department's out talking to the vendor saying, hey, give me a quote on this item. And so we like to have that to confirm that the shipping terms are whatever they are, whether we're paying freight or we're not, and to confirm the price and confirm availability. And it's just good support information to have when we do the purchase order. That answer your question?
Yes, it's just that I share this information with the staff people, and they are going out and getting information. It doesn't have a quote, and then I come back to them and say, I need a quote on this.
Yeah,
It's just a little technical part.
yeah, it's, I can tell you that we aren't probably quite as strict on that as other institutions. I know at SCSU, if you submit an order without a quote, you're not going to get it. They're going to hold it. We don't quite go to that extreme, but we certainly like to have the quote if we can. Thank you. Other questions? All right, so then let's get into services a little bit. I think we're right on time. We'll finish here within the hour. So services are handled differently than our equipment and supplies. And so we have different rules. Again, though, if you're using grant funds, these rules still apply. And so we have to follow them. So we have two types of services. We have professional and non-professional. So we'll start on the non-professional services. So those are related to things that are physical or manual in nature, things like snow removal, tree trimming, cleaning services, that type of thing. Our state law requires that if the total contract is going to be over $25,000, we have to put it out for bid. And it's got to be through a formal bid process, either an invitation for bid or a request for proposal. We tend to do mostly invitations for bid on non-professional services because it's really, we've done a lot of cleaning service contracts lately. So we want this facility cleaned on these days and these are the requirements. And so it's pretty straightforward. So it comes down to price basically in that regard. But we have the RFP available if need be. And so there are some exceptions to that or exemptions like on the commodity side. If it's a sole source, it's a service you absolutely nobody else can do the work or whatever, we can declare it a sole source. Or if it's an emergency, that happens occasionally when Not long ago, we had a fire over in, I forget, Dakota, East Hall, somewhere over there. And we had to get a company in right away to do the cleanup, get the water or the smoke and whatever cleaned up. And it's not something you can, okay, we're going to set aside now. We're going to wait 2 weeks for the bid process to get a vendor in here. So in those cases, we like to try to contact at least a couple of vendors to try to get some at least estimates on pricing, but emergency orders are a possibility. Normally, if it's something that threatens life, property, and security, that type of thing. And then professional services. And again, on these services, we aren't issuing purchase orders. We're issuing contracts. And so some of you are familiar with the contract setup we have in DocuSign. We are moving away from, not moving away from DocuSign, but we're moving to a new contracting system. It's in Jagger, South Dakota Easy Buy. It's just another module. So we've started doing training there. And those of you that haven't been contacted, you will be at some time here over the spring semester, and try to get people trained on it. So then the professional services, the definition there is it's really something mental, intellectual. It's like consulting companies, it's marketing firms, it's guest speakers, it's those types of things. State law requires there that if it's over $50,000, we have to go through an RFP process. And that RFP process the RFP itself has to be posted out on the state's procurement site. We can't put it on our own site and call it good. We have to use their site. In this regard, we have an actual RFP form that we use that identifies certain evaluation criteria that's required as part of the process. And then along with that, we ask the department to provide a scope of services. So what is it you want this vendor to do? And all of that's put together, and we put it out on this RFP process. And then the department's required to score the results. So if we get 4 proposals in, we have a scoring sheet. You go through and evaluate each proposal, score them according to how we have it set up, and then we can award to the highest ranked vendor, providing we can come to an agreement with them. If we can't, we move on to the next highest ranked vendor. I won't go into all the details because it's kind of a long process, but just know that that is out there and it is required by law. I did notice in state law when I was looking this morning, though, that when I've talked about the exemption for, you know, computer hardware and software and lab equipment and supplies, there's also an exemption for basically for services for research projects under the Board of Regents. So if you've got a research project and you require some type of a service and it's being paid for with a grant, it's actually exempt from this process that I just explained. So keep that in mind. We'll work with you. If you identify a service you need, we'll talk about the funding source. We'll talk about what the requirements are, and then we can follow the right process. So I think this came up a few years ago, and it kind of had to do with the privacy of research. You know, you don't want it out there to the world what you're doing because you're kind of trying to control that research in yourself. And so I think that's why they exempted some of those service contracts to keep it more private and let us do our research the way we prefer to do so. All right, and then I already talked about contracting authority with the president having delegated the authority or issuing delegated authority. Some of the tools we use here, I've talked a little bit about DocuSign. Contracts Plus is what we call the new contracting system. DocuSign is tied to the back end of it. And so when you create a contract in the system, it'll go out for signatures through DocuSign and they work together. The information flows back and forth between the two systems. So we implemented that. We went live August 1st. We've so far trained, I don't know, 8 to 10 departments probably, and quite a few more to go. So you'll be hearing from us if you haven't already. Questions on services before we move on? All right, and then the next is just some procurement
Question for you.
tools. Yes.
Sorry. Are repairments and regular maintenances for scientific equipment considered as professional services or regular purchases?
What was the example again?
Are repairs and regular maintenance for scientific equipment
Yeah, good question. So repairs, if you're repairing equipment, you're repairing something, it's not considered a professional service. It's a non-professional. And actually, there is another exemption in state law that maintenance contracts are also exempt from the purchasing rules. So if we have an example would be, we've got a chiller on a building that needs some major maintenance and it's going to be $100,000. That maintenance contract actually can be considered exempt. And oftentimes they are, because you have a particular vendor that's supporting and maintaining that equipment. So it doesn't make sense to go out and try to get another company to come in and do the maintenance. So a couple things there. It's non-professional and it could also be exempt depending on the situation. Okay, other questions? That's it. All right, so just some purchasing tools I referenced. South Dakota Easy Buy. That's where we have our punch out catalogs. It's where you do your requisitions. We have links to the various contracts that we've talked about and other forms, purchasing forms that you may need. The online bid systems, we have two. Sourcing Managers is our Board of Regents system that we solicit bids through. Central Bid Exchange is a state procurement site. Both are available to vendors and the general public. And then Banner, of course, is our ERP system, where we do all of our financial management for grants. Of course, you're managing your funds there. Invoices are paid through Banner, and the receiving process is also done in Banner. And then kind of getting to the end here, just some contact information. Myself, Linda, and Raleigh were the three people in the procurement office, and we can all help you in regards to your purchases, whether it be for equipment or services. And contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to us and we'll help you as we can. With that, kind of get to the wrap up and any last questions you might have. Sean?
Darby, I just had a question on that new contract system for services. So from my understanding, the whole contract amount gets encumbered in Banner.
Oh, you're talking about the new contracting system? Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
so some of our reports, subtract the encumbrances out. And so
Mhm.
it looks like it's been over, more of the budget's been used than what really has been.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So, and plus this, sometimes the contract amount may not be used in full. I'm talking,
Mhm.
this is referring to like
Yep.
a cleaning contract. So it kind of overstates or
So, yeah, so in
overstates
regards to
things.
that, first of all, we haven't necessarily nailed down the general encumbrance process. For those of you that may not know what it is, what we're moving to is when you use the new contracting system and issue a contract for services, then in Banner, you do a general encumbrance. So you encumber the funds that cover that contract, right? So it's like a purchase order. When you do a purchase order, we encumber your funds, so they're set aside for that purchase. Same thing will be true on the service side. We're still working out the details of what's required, what isn't required. I can tell you functionally, when you do a general encumbrance in Banner and you make a payment against it, it'll reduce that encumbrance amount, just like it does on a purchase order. And then when you make your final payment, it'll liquidate any remaining encumbrance that's there.
so if it will not be spent in full,
Mhm.
then who's responsible for removing the difference?
So if it's not spent in full, a couple of things. One, if it's going to be finalized in the current fiscal year, we can end the encumbrance and liquidate whatever's remaining. If it's going to extend into another fiscal year and you've spent part of it this year, that remaining amount will roll over into the new fiscal year, just like a purchase order does. Then you'll be able to pay against it next year. There are other considerations. Some have said, well, the library where Cheryl, they had a large subscription contract a week or two ago. A lot, like, I don't know what it was, $300,000, something like that. 6 or 7 different fund sources they were going to use. And it's being paid over 3 or 4 years. So in that case, we recommended you do an encumbrance just for the current fiscal year. Make your payments against it. Next year, do another general encumbrance for that fiscal year. Otherwise, you tie up your whole budget in one fiscal year when you don't need to. So I don't know if that's kind of getting to what you were asking. So there's some options there. We're still working with Jessica and Shelley Brunick on what's the requirement going to be for general encumbrances. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it. The more we talk to departments, there are more considerations that we need to think about. So nothing final yet, but we are working on it.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
So in the Office of Research, when we're helping to prepare budgets, the federal or the RFP will allow certain, items to be placed on there. But then our PIs are getting frustrated because when they're awarded and they try to submit these items that are allowed on the budget, they get stopped because of the state rules. So generally, what do you see? Are there certain expenses that cause a problem generally with federal versus state? Or are they
So the
pretty-
grant allows certain items to be bought, right?
Mhm.
And now they want to buy something that's not on that approved list?
No, it's on the,
Okay,
the feds might allow it, but then it's not a lot of cases, but then it might go against our state guidelines. So
Hmm.
then they can't purchase it. So do you see that a lot or that, I'm just hearing?
I've not heard of it myself, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Now, if you give an example, I'd certainly look into it.
Okay,
But if the grant allows it, I don't know why.
because the state and federal should be pretty
But if
close,
the-
right?
But if the grant allows the money to be spent on that particular item,
Mhm.
I can't think of a reason that we should not allow it based on state rules. The only thing I can think of is it some type of equipment that USD won't support or
Okay.
doesn't
Thank you.
physically work with our infrastructure, our buildings, whatever, and kind of thrown wide things out there, but
Okay,
that's the only thing I can think of. But if you can give me some examples, certainly look into it.
okay,
Okay.
sounds good.
Other questions? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much. One more? Yep.
Works, sorry, about how participant compensation works. And I'm wondering from a variety of perspectives, like from if we want to pay a participant using like a gift card or cash, because we saw them in person, or what if it's like an online study and then we want to do like an online gift card? And then also, what about platforms like MTurk or Prolific, where you can also pay participants?
So this is an area we're working on, I can tell you that. So gift cards, I'll just use that as the general term, but you've got recipients from a survey or some type of research project and you want to award them with cash or gift cards or something. And so the gift cards, first of all, they have to be approved by grants accounting if it's being funded with grant money, or if it's not grant money, then Justin Noren in the accounting office. So if he'll approve the purchase of the gift cards, then there's a couple of options. What we've been doing most of the time lately, we've got a credit card in my office that's not a state procurement card. It's used for other things. And we can use that credit card. We had one the other day. We bought 20 or so gift cards from card to be used for recipients. Now there are, and I'm not the expert on this, but there are some rules around gift cards. One was sending them electronically because controlling who has access to them. So that's an issue. There's another issue with mailing them because you have no control over, are they going to get to the person that they're intended for? And so there are some issues there. I think the other thing we're trying to work on, Val and I talked about it this morning, or Jan, I guess it was. From the Board of Regents perspective, there's a discussion about should we have a system in place that manages these types of transactions? And there are companies out there that do that. And so it's on it went through the Bureau, Business Affairs Council meeting a few months ago. And I think USD has kind of gotten volunteered to kind of lead that. We haven't gotten to that point of being able to put an RFI, RFP together or anything, but we are going to be looking into it. I told Jan and Val this morning that pretty soon we'll be through some of our other projects and now we can start looking at that. And so I don't know a lot about it yet. All I know is that there are companies where you can manage the transmission of gift cards and things like that through their system that insurers are getting to the people they're supposed to go to. And it makes the management of it much easier than on our end, what we're trying to do today. You want to use the
If you get
mic there,
people-
Val?
Oh, sorry, especially in the area of those folks that are gonna get over $600 or more a year. Those systems track it for the 1099 then and make it very easy. You fill out a W-9 first, and then you can refill that gift card or Visa debit card, whatever, as they come in and do more things online for you or whatever. So especially in that area, it would be very helpful.
So there'll be more to come on that. I'm hoping over the, spring, summer months, we'll get things together and hopefully identify some companies and figure out where we go from there. But it's not just a USD initiative, so we'll be working with the other schools too on it. Other questions? All right, if not, I guess we've got 2 minutes to spare, so there you go. So thank you very much for coming out. I hope the information was useful and let us know if you have questions. Thank you.